you've got to have a smart, thought out
Agreed.
brand strategy. So with that includes, the positioning. Make sure you are understanding the cultural nuances. And then from those insights, build up foundational assets that you can use, which would include media agnostic messaging, um, so that there is a sound brand strategy foundation that you can then apply to um, marketing communications. And to be particularly mindful, we're going to keep saying it over and over again, one size does not fit
Mhm.
all in America.
Welcome to a new episode of the Value Driven Marketing Podcast. I am Elena, your host, and if you are a business owner or a leader of a company that is considering expanding into the US, you're in luck. We are releasing a new episode on what it takes to successfully tap into the United States, featuring Rodger Jones this time and Bryan Forbes, both from Bader Rutter, North America's #1 B2B agency and #1 agri-marketing agency. In this episode, we are diving deeper into communication styles, decision making, and how to prepare for a successful market entry. You will learn why the direct and action oriented communication style is preferred, why silence can be a double edged sword, and how to address it, as well as success factors for entering the US market. Fully committing to brand and storytelling, adapting your positioning, testing before you scale, focusing on outcome based communications, and much more. First, I would like to take the chance to introduce my guests today. Rodger Jones is Brand Strategy Director at Bader Rutter. He is the co-developer of the proven brand asset management model, or BAM for short, that has been used successfully across over 100 brands around the world. Rodger has contributed to building business for clients through brand management in several US and UK agencies. He holds a Master of Arts in Organizational Communication and has worked for an extensive range of B2B clients. Bryan Forbes, he is Strategic Planning Director Lead at Bader Rutter and brings over 20 years of experience in marketing. He specializes in uniting strategy, creative, and business growth. Bryan cuts through the noise of today's complex landscape to uncover insights, inspire ideas, and deliver impact. His work spans global brands like Dell B2B, Budweiser, Abbott Nutrition, and GI Tractors. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you do, please consider sharing it with a friend and following the show on Spotify to stay updated when we release new content. Thank you. Good morning, Rodger. Good morning, Bryan. Welcome to the Value Driven Marketing Podcast. Very excited to have the two of you on the show. How are things on your end?
Good. I would say here in Chicago, we're rolling into fall and looking forward to all the continued work that we're doing. But I think Rodger, you're up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Right. Bryan and I work for the same agency. He's in the Chicago office, and I'm about 90 miles north in the Milwaukee office. And no, I echo what Bryan says. It's a marvelous time of year here as it switches from summer to fall, which we're more happy to see than winter. Winter in the Midwest is not the best time. But no, business is good, and it's a marvelous time of year.
Nice to hear. Bucharest is quite gloomy today, so I'm not excited, but we'll handle it. I would love to know more about Bader Rutter. So can you guys let me know who you serve, how you help, and what you do in your respective roles?
I'll start. Bader Rutter is a B2B marketing agency across multiple different verticals within the U.S. market, spanning agriculture from crops to cattle to vaccines for cattle across multiple different verticals within agriculture. There's also then the food and beverage side of the business, where we are working on multiple different types of brands and companies that are in a B2B sense, having their products be put on menus, having their products be put forth to large kind of industrial facilities, but then also within different contexts of cafeterias and things along those lines. So large play within agriculture and food and bev. A 50 plus year old company that has been around for a long time within the Milwaukee and Chicago markets, the number one B2B marketing agency within the US for probably about 3, 4 years in a row now. I'm highly ingrained. We've got about 200 employees across the US, with a majority of them based in the Milwaukee and Chicagoland area. We'd like to say we were working remote before remote was even a thing, because we do have about a certain percentage of our employee base that is remote. But I would say, across the board, a very astute and smart B2B marketing shop that has lots of different client bases across agriculture, food and bev, and we do a lot of business for multiple types of companies within industrial, but then also within the food and bev, and also within the agriculture base. So lots of great companies, lots of big brands, lots of big names, global names, and then we're going to talk about later. But Roger, I don't know if there's anything else you
Mhm.
wanted to explain. And just for clarification, I'm a strategic brand planning director. So what I do, and Roger and I complement each other. What I do is help align strategy from a communications perspective, but then also align with a little bit of
Mhm.
business consulting perspective for companies that are either launching new products, doing new initiatives within the market, but also on the marketing side, where I'd like to say I have one foot in business and one foot in helping make creative advertising, or advertising within the B2B market more relevant and customer based. And I know we talk about outcomes based and what it does for the customer at the end of the day. But I tightly align with Roger, my colleague here, who I'll let him introduce himself. But it's very nice to be here today, and thank you.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to Brian's explanation to the agency, particularly within this context of working with you, is that
Sure.
BBN, we started our relationship with BBN about 25 years ago.
Mhm.
And so it's been around quite a long time. And we have been uh, heavily involved partners for over 25 years. So my name is Rodger Jones. My title is Director of Brand Asset Management. Brand Asset Management is often referred to as BAM, the acronym, is our proprietary brand strategy planning model for B2B. It's very robust, and it's usually the first step in an engagement. As Brian said, he and I will partner on setting the brand strategy foundation, which results in multiple assets, which then those assets are applied into his marketing communications planning. One of the most important parts about it, though, is that it secures alignment early on with the client because it's highly collaborative. And you guys know how torturously difficult it is to get client alignment. So when you work with them from the outset, Brian then has a foundation that they've already bought into. So that's why we
Mhm.
work closely together.
So you have a rich history, really interesting background. So very, very excited to learn from both of you. And maybe just to set the context of our subject today, expanding into the US, the companies that we tend to work with in the tech sector, IT services, many of them are looking to expand into the US. Of course, is a huge market, perhaps one of the biggest markets in the world. Very attractive. At the same time, actually making the leap over the ocean literally is no easy feat. So there are many things you need to address. Of course, the planning, the researching, understanding the competition, how to position, but also the more softer side of things of, how do people make decisions? How do they communicate? What is the context? So I would like to start with the softer aspects and then dive into the more, let's say, pragmatic things. And let's talk about culture and business etiquette first, and also language, because I think that is important. Some things can get lost in translation, literally. So what is the preferred communication style over into the US?
Well, here, I'm going to pick up on something you said, Elena, and we also were reflecting on like the culture that ties into the kind of the culture and mentality in the US and cultural differences. I used to live in England and I've done a lot of work in Europe and around the world. And living in another country makes one look very differently at
Hmm.
their home country. And one of the things that I saw straight away, and you've probably seen this too, when doing business in America, you have to remember that it is a massive country. We've got an East Coast, we've got a Midwest, we've got a South, we've got a Southwest, we have a Northwest, we have a West Coast. So it's not a homogeneous culture.
Hmm.
And these regions have distinct differences in culture, and they can even have distinct differences in dialect. Of course, it's English, but there can be very distinct accents. So you've got to stay rooted in that. And the communication style can vary. I would say in the Midwest, where I am, it's more of a friendly and open in general. You know, a lot of the historical precedent in the Midwest is farming, so it creates a more of a friendlier, open culture. Now it's going to be a little bit different because down south where Brian is, that's a massive city in Chicago. So I'll let him kind of comment on your question about communication
Yeah,
styles in
and
America.
Roger, that's a great point, and Elaine, I'm glad you brought that up. Think of the U.S. market as a microcosm of almost 50 different countries. And, there's 50 different states, but I love the fact that you
Hmm.
delineated East Coast, West Coast, and the different nuances within each kind of region within the country. But there's kind of a unifying business conversational tone that carries throughout things within the US. And I would say, good, bad, or indifferent. It's a direct, concise, action-oriented kind of tone and business conversation where, to be honest, people tend to get to the point relatively quickly, especially within business
Hmm.
conversations. There's different nuances to that. The West Coast may have a different style of getting to that. The New York is very a little bit more, or the East Coast a little bit more aggressive. But I would say, as a whole, looking at the market, this concise, action oriented, conversational tone is kind of looked at as the standard for business speak. Now, I would say one thing, and I know there's different nuances globally from this perspective, but the silence sometimes in conversations from a business perspective can be interpreted as a good thing, but also it can be interpreted as a disagreement or lack of understanding. And specifically within the US market, silence carries a little bit of a double edged sword when you're talking in business. It's either being very
Hmm.
contemplative and understanding or not understanding. And that's a little bit of a nuance within the US market that is different than different markets. But just to point that out, verbal affirmation is very, very common within business context. And I think that's one of the key things to take away, that direct, concise, action oriented tone, but also sometimes silence can be interpreted
Hmm.
good or in bad within a business context.
And how would you say is the best way to approach silence? Would it be best to come back and ask for clarification?
Yeah,
What's
I
the
think,
best approach here?
when it's that clarification, or there's the old saying from an old brand in the US: when EF Hutton talks, people listen. But EF Hutton doesn't talk that much.
Hmm.
And they listen a lot. And that interpretation of listening and digesting and understanding what a business colleague is saying, um, asking a question back, or restating, hey, I heard you say X, does that mean Y or Z? Is kind of a way to I wouldn't say counter, but to amend what could be in silence be perceived as potentially maybe a lack of understanding or something like that. But I think there's different ways to approach that.
Okay. So be direct, stick to the point, know what you're going to say. Um, and in terms of decision making styles, because, okay, communication is one aspect, but then it matters how people make decisions and how you should maybe plan your process ahead. What would you say is the most representative way in which you guys make decisions? Is
Let
it?
me comment a little bit first, and then Brian will add his perspective. One of the things to reflect on and we see is you have to put it into the context of the size of the
Yes.
organization you're working with.
Mm-hmm.
And as you can imagine, with we mostly have very large accounts, but we'll work with smaller companies at times. So smaller privately owned companies or will have fewer people involved in the decision making process, so it can go quicker. Whereas, and that might also make it more relationship oriented. You can get to know the people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we're working with a large organization and we might be pitching through a procurement department, it's massive and there are multiple stakeholders, and each of those has to be shown the specific value that they need to see to kind of check the box for their department. So, one way to think about the decision process is it's going to flex depending on the size and scope and scale of the organization.
Thank you for clarifying that. And I'm wondering, in terms of business etiquette, what are the things that one needs to pay attention to?
Before we move to that, because Brian is more on the front lines, let him comment on how decisions are made because he's actually closer to clients often than I am. Brian was just adding a little bit more to what I mentioned about how
Mhm.
decisions were made. So if
Yeah,
you
I think
could,
generally
Brian.
within the US, and this is a bit of a blanket statement, but this decentralized kind of fast-paced decision making driven by data-driven arguments or having data to back up the argument or the thing that you're trying to kind of pursue or push through. There's a little bit of that coupled with business intuition and experience. But what I would say at the end of the day, speed and decisiveness are often seen as competitive advantages in the US, and thus kind of business decisions are made with a bit of decentralized, fast pace processes, for lack of a better word.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I guess for someone who's trying to do business in the States, that translates into being fast, be decisive, know your data,
Yep,
don't wander around. Okay, get to the point
absolutely,
quite fast.
absolutely,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Okay. In terms of business etiquette, are there things to be aware of? Is there something you could do to maybe offend or, get on the wrong foot? What should we pay attention to?
Well, Roger, do you want to start with this, and I can add some flavor?
Yeah, and one of the things, and particularly, it's no secret around the world of our political divisiveness today
Mhm.
in America. So stay
Yeah.
away from politics, either overtly or inadvertently. That can be an absolute disaster to bring a political point of view into a business setting.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and the other one, too, is that just be sensitive to diversity and don't inadvertently bring any prejudices in. You know, really be sensitive to diversity because we've got a
Hmm.
multicultural country and there are all types of people in business and you never know what's in their hearts and their minds. So just make sure that you're very respectful. The other one I would say, and I've seen it can work or not work, is just also be
Yeah.
careful with jokes
Mm.
because something you think is funny could absolutely backfire in a business setting. So I would say to be more polite and buttoned up
Mhm.
than coming in and trying to immediately be their best friend
Yeah.
and joking
Yeah.
around and whatnot.
Roger, I want
But
to add to that because I think that's
I'm sure
fabulous. See,
Brian,
punctuality
yeah.
and being organized and can come across as
Mhm.
confidence, which is highly valued in a business situation. And I
Mm.
think Roger hit upon some of what I'll call the softer side of things. You don't talk personal finances, you don't talk religion, you don't talk politics, even overly personal questions. You know, uh, um, those tend to what we'll call raise an eyebrow. Humor can be a good levity moment, a bringer of a conversation in business, but it has to be professional. To Roger's point, But I think one of the highest or biggest things that we see is just punctuality, and being organized comes across as being confident and knowing your stuff that you're talking about. And there's a lot of
Hmm.
times where sometimes we may not see that, and it's changed to a certain degree during this post-pandemic era where a lot of people are looking and talking with each other on screens, but there's still those same principles apply when you're having a business conversation. And I can't stress enough the aspect of punctuality and organization, because that helps the conversation move forward in a way that is kind of the norm here within the US versus loosey goosey. And a good, bad, or indifferent, that
Yeah.
buttoned up aspect of it is key. But again, I think Roger hit upon it. There's a lot of a huge nation full of a ton of different types of individuals, and a business appropriate conversation where we don't talk the politics, the religions, the personal finances, or even an individual's uh, um, look, feel, or character. So lots of different nuances, but I'm sure it's
Hmm.
kind of universal. Just be nice and be humble and be smart.
I'm thinking outside of confidence, what other traits are also valuable in a business setting?
Um, you know, One thing I would say, and this, it seems like it's a no brainer, but continual eye contact, and that, what I would say, visual engagement in the body tone and language, and being interested in the conversation that you're having, that opens up the door of kind of personal connection. I think Roger hit upon that a little bit earlier. um, that's one that's I've seen lost a little bit, especially in this post-pandemic era when we're all just staring at each other on screens. But in a business context, confidence, the ability to connect with someone, but also, third, and I think this is just as important, trying to understand where someone's coming from. That's key, but that's kind of what I'll call a little bit of the softer side of things.
Hmm.
I can't emphasize enough the punctuality of meeting times, or being present and in the moment and on time.
Let me just add to that a little bit. Brian's brought up the importance of empathy, and empathy really comes from
Yes.
active listening. And I have to coach consistently to actively listen. Don't use it as waiting for your turn to talk. Really, truly understand what it is they're saying. We have
Mm.
one new business, and these are almost direct quotes where they really listened to us. They heard what we were saying. So I would just reinforce that active listening. And I always tell people we have two ears and one mouth for a reason. You're supposed to listen more than talk.
Yeah.
So that's what
Yeah.
I would add.
Hmm. Very, very wise advice. Duly noted. So, Roger, Brian, I'm wondering, of course, the cultural aspects are very important, but also knowing the market is equally important. And I'm curious, what are the best sources or the sources you would recommend in order to research a specific sector, industry sector, a specific market? Where would you go to find data and all sorts of information about competition, how big the
Yeah.
market is,
Yeah.
and so
And
on.
Roger, if you don't mind, I'll start there. I want to come back to something that we said in the beginning, how the US is a microcosm of many different regions and makeups, and
Mhm.
different contexts. And there's I want to just kind of talk through, there's kind of macro US understanding resources from a business context, and then there's regional. There's if specifically looking in the kind of the SaaS or tech industry area, there's the Gartners of the world that look at IT and SaaS and kind of the tech driven sectors. There's Forrester, there's McKinsey, there's the IBIS world, and then there's Statistia. All of those provide what I'll call great macro overviews that break down into a little bit of like regional differences to a certain degree and to a certain scale. But broad business intelligence, those are some of the things that I use as a go-to every day. When you start to drill down and you start looking at individual regions. Let's just take, for example, the Midwest here, because I'm in the Midwest. There are different sources of Midwest research. There's this thing called PitchBook, which is a private company that provides financials and kind of VC money understandings of companies and things along those lines. There's also a place called CP Insights, which is kind of a startup, and they're emerging in the landscape, but they're providing market performance on a little bit more of a regional level. But when you start to get down to that regional level, there's business journals. So say, for example, one of my clients is a big global forklift provider, um, under the Toyota umbrella.
Mhm.
They have specific regional business journals. In our case, there's one that talks about the lift industry just within the Midwest, or the lift industry within kind of different regions. So I would emphasize that whatever sector it's in, there's definitely going to be a business journal or association or sector journals that are great for understanding the regional nuances of that. ANA for marketing is a great resource. NAM, the National Association of Manufacturers, a great resource for marketing, or for manufacturing information. The HIMSS and healthcare IT is a great regional resource. There's lots of different ways to kind of get at that, but I would say, there's high level macro, but then each individual sector has
Mhm.
regional journals, associations, or even kind of subgroups that all have websites, that all have content that can help understanding those differences in regional markets. Because my Midwest market is much different than my Southern market, which is much different than the California market that we deal with. And all of those have different kind of subtle nuances, but they all have their own individual journals, or trade industry type of
Mhm.
resources that are great to tap into and understand.
Mhm. Mhm. And I think maybe a valuable point also would be to, of course, segment the market and start from somewhere rather than try and go
That's a
very
test and
broad.
learn pilot that I would say on something. And I do want to just add one other piece, like regionally within the US. If you look at, like, we all know Silicon Valley is known for tech and SaaS. Atlanta is known for supply chains and SaaS products. When we look at Chicago, it's really more manufacturing and logistics. When we look at New York, it's really finance and media. When we start looking at Austin, Texas, it's more around startups and fintech and things along those lines, whereas Boston is biotech and healthcare. So even within those city delineations, there's what I would say core
Mhm.
competencies that are kind of regionally spread around, and you'll see a lot of companies, depending on what sector they're in, specifically within in tech and digital, going to those markets where they may be hotbeds of that type of work that's being done there. But and I apologize, you'd asked a question
Mhm.
kind of, involved in that a little bit more. If you could just restate it, I would appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I was just commenting, given the big nature of the market, it makes sense to be very wise and segment rather than, think I'll go to the US and I'll just test
And
to
I would
target
just add
first.
3 bullet points to that, because you're hitting upon something that is a best practice of launching in the US. You know, use
Mhm.
market size data, US market size data, to understand your segments or the population of where you're either launching your product, or trying to engage in your B2B customer product. Secondarily, pick 3 to 4 priority markets that you want to focus and
Mhm.
test learn before you even try to scale on, because the kiss of death within the US market is thinking you can come in and scale instantly everywhere. That requires a lot of money, b, a ton of different understanding, and c, a lot of different nuance and understanding. And I would prioritize key markets, but then layer in, if there's an opportunity where a new company is launching in the US, to have localized sources there, and localized individuals. And I think one of the keys that we were maybe talking about, or kind of maybe hitting upon a little bit earlier, is having a US presence is a good thing. It's not necessarily looked down upon if you don't, but having some sort of US presence where you can point to and say, we have an office in Charlotte, we have an office in Chicago, or some sort of localized presence goes a long way, because within the US market, they look at that and say, well, now we have an individual or a person where we can go, and that main point of contact versus if someone was just
Mhm.
abroad. But Roger, I know you might probably have some thoughts on that too. But use market data to figure out where you launch. Prioritize 3 to 4 markets within the
Mhm.
region. You can't squeeze everything at once within the US. It's just not feasible unless you're a unicorn and you have millions of dollars to do that. And then layer in local resources if you can.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
the only part I would add, because Brian has massive knowledge on the data side of gaining that intelligence, and I would just supplement that when possible with one-on-one interviews. You can find ways to access people that are within the segment that you're trying to be knowledgeable about. We use those one-on-one interviews to get the emotional intelligence to understand the challenges and opportunities as well, and it can result in tremendous insights that we often apply
Yeah.
in pitches, and that the clients and the prospects can be given an emotional connection, and it accelerates their knowledge of us understanding. I'm not discounting the incredible importance of the
Right.
data that Brian's mentioning to make business decisions, but these are also,
Yep.
there's an emotional side to it. So I would you find a way to get access to some people, ask some thoughtful questions. And the other one, I don't want it to go without saying because it's spoken about too much. We will engage either ourselves or with our AI team, particularly on new business. Obviously, AI augmented insight gathering is a real boost to gaining insights required for regional specificity and understanding the
Hmm.
American market.
And because you touched on localization, how would you advise companies that are considering expanding in the States that they think about localization? So, how should they adapt their positioning, their messaging? And also, I'm thinking also in terms, you mentioned it's important to have someone on the ground. In the first phase, for example, if you are maybe selling services, so that's kind of it's not a physical product, but other service, is local presence important?
Well, let me try to answer that. There are quite a few thoughts in that one. One was what type of assets are required, Elena? I
Mhm.
think that was
Yep.
one. Let me just comment, and then Brian has a greater need for more assets than I do. From my perspective, and we do this all the time in our engagements, you've got to have a smart, thought out
Agreed.
brand strategy. So with that includes, the positioning. Make sure you are understanding the cultural nuances, and then from those insights, build up foundational assets that you can use, which would include media agnostic messaging, um, so that there is a sound brand strategy foundation that you can then apply to um, marketing communications. And to be particularly mindful, we're going to keep saying it over and over again, one size does not fit
Hmm.
all in America. And if you come in and try to have some sweeping generalization that this is going to work in America, it's like,
Mhm.
ah, I
Well,
don't
and
think so.
Roger, to build a little point upon that, because I think you hit upon something key, is the positioning. So everyone's familiar with the Tesco brand out of the UK. Very big, prominent UK retailer.
Mhm.
They tried to enter the US market in 2007. They actually, after in 2013, left the US market after losing a little over $1 billion. Um, because what they didn't do is they didn't reposition themselves for the US market. What they did was open up stores in California, Nevada, and Arizona, and the Southwest and the West, but they didn't assimilate their positioning from what was in the UK Tesco model to the US model in terms of how even their in-store experience and understanding US shopping habits. of individuals within grocery stores. They didn't adapt. They didn't adapt. They thought the power of Tesco could come in and launch. And at the end of the day, they ended up leaving the US markets. They were within this kind of fresh and easy store name that they had. But they kind of
Mm-hmm.
underinvested or misunderstood the cultural adaptation of US shoppers here, and that model did not carry over, and they lost a lot of money and exited the market with kind of doing
Wow.
a little bit of the
Okay.
wrong positioning. And positioning can be vast and large, but picking that big model up that worked so well within the UK and not adapting that to the US market didn't come through in their positioning and even their messaging, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's
Let
quite,
me
yeah. Yeah, yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead,
let me
Roger.
just take, because you have both of us on this call for a reason. I've talked about the importance of the foundational brand strategy assets, but those are a
Yeah.
starting point, and Brian's responsible for building a lot more than that. So, Brian, maybe say, okay, how do you bridge then into what type of Marcom planning
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
assets would
Yeah.
you
Um,
recommend?
so just specifically when we start talking about Marcom planning and a kind of a stable of key things you need to have. So Roger and I work hand in hand with developing great brand foundation, understanding markets, understanding customers. Then there's a pivot into what we'll call marketing or Marcom communications, where any US company or any company that's coming into the US has to have kind of four key things in line outside of identifying their key markets that they want to like launch in or test and learn in before they scale. A website that tells your story that's optimized for US audiences, clear value propositions. Within the B2B landscape, testimonials, case studies, and even pricing clarity of what your product is within a professionally done website is pretty key. Secondarily, within the B2B landscape specifically, marketing collateral materials. So clear what I'll call customer benefit or outcomes. What's the outcome that your product's going to give me? Not text and spec. That's kind of standard. But what's the outcome or the benefit it's going to give a customer within one pagers, explainer videos, adapted to US communication style? It's kind of direct, benefit driven, and to be honest, visually clean collateral material is table stakes for entering the US. And then, particularly when we start looking at the socials, having a professional and buttoned up LinkedIn presence that is kind of industry standard, in addition to on different channels, having engaging content that at times could talk the functional side of your tech and spec, but also talk the emotional,
Mm-hmm.
benefit driven, the outcome that X, Y, or Z SaaS piece of software may provide a company. And that's tough to get to in B2B. And it's an ever evolving market where historically it used to be, oh, talk to me about the text and spec. And we're moving, and it has been for 10 years, to more of an outcome based, what I'll say, process of understanding what can the piece of tech do for me and my company now versus just the technology and how it's going to fit within my stack. And, I would say lastly, um, you know, Roger hit upon this, and him and I are cut from the same cloth. Branding and storytelling. Everyone wants to tell a good story, and in these days, everyone's all about storytelling that highlights not only the features and the benefits, but the values and the mission and the differentiation of the company and the product. Um, Roger talked about the value of branding and storytelling. And if you don't have that in line and you can't tell your story via what I'd call the professionally accepted channels of a website or LinkedIn, it's really hard to get traction. And then if you regionalize that even more and you start with pilots, the importance of that kind of value driven benefit messaging coupled with the brand story and mission and purpose really begins to differentiate and is almost table stakes, to be honest, these days within any company, but specifically for companies coming to the US and identifying certain markets that they want to engage with.
And so you've brought the story of Tesco. I'm hoping we can bring also some positive, successful story of companies that have expanded into the US. And you've already mentioned a lot of different aspects, but I'm hoping we can talk about a success
Yeah,
story as well
yeah.
and what that
Well, and
company did
I'll
before.
start with
Mm-hmm.
one that kind of everyone knows a little bit, and I just everyone knows about this Swedish company, consumer oriented, Spotify. Spotify launched in the US in a
Mm-hmm.
very, what I'll call, smart way, because they did it by, not necessarily instantly aligning with all of the big publishers and music houses and things like that. They did it a bit organically, and that's a success story, but I wanna turn it to kind of a little bit of B2B, and this is going back a few years, but, SAP, a German company, that
Mm-hmm.
supplies a lot of different software applications for different business needs. They, and to a certain degree, kind of helped take over certain parts of the market by, having localized sales teams. They identified key markets and even key verticals and industries that they wanted to engage with. And this is going back probably to the I think I would say mid '90s, but mostly around, more importantly within the past 10 years here in the U.S. They also formed strategic partnerships, and that's a key thing also with IBM, large consulting firms, to embed their SAP systems within those companies. And then what they did was they scaled by focusing on enterprise companies. They do have a lot of money backing them, so they can scale that way. They focus on Fortune 500 companies who already were looking for these kind of ERP solutions. But another good
Mm-hmm.
example is Spotify. Now, our direct north neighbor, in Canada, Spotify has essentially become the B2B to C platform of choice for selling, direct to consumer, or you could even apply it to B2B these days, where they focused on small to medium businesses and their positioning. um, they looked at more of an ecosystem type play, where they had their kind of app marketplace, and they partnered with different payment, companies and providers, and they did aggressive US storytelling and branding of their product. The outcome was, now I think, Shopify is 65% market share or revenue share, making kind of the dominant in the US market. Again, I know that's a company that's a little bit north of us, in Canada. But those two, they're big money spenders. There's much more examples of smaller kind of regional companies coming in. But I wanted to just highlight, SAP and Shopify, both from because they're from the tech sector, but they also approached it with some principles. Some principles of focusing on their segment. Uh, um, Shopify having that ecosystem play. The importance of strategic partnerships, like for SAP with IBM or things along those lines. As a company breaking into the US marketplace, those strategic partnerships are key, because that's almost kind of how business is done these days. A standalone solution as a product is fine, but how you get that product into the hands of customers and users often happens via the credibility of partners that are here and bigger players also. So just wanted to kind of stress that importance a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So don't discount the importance of partners,
Yeah. Yep.
resellers, can help you gain a foot in the market. I'm wondering if we were to maybe wrap up and summarize what we talked, what would be one core advice you would give companies that are looking to make the leap and expand into the US?
Raj, you want to go?
Well, I can restate one and then let Brian close it off. I would just and having lived overseas and looked back across the ocean on America, is that you've got to remember that the United States is not a
Yeah.
monolithic culture. It's massive. And when I would try to explain Europe to Americans, I would say, well, you got to understand, Europe is a lot of different countries, and America is the same way. Brian said it at the outset. It's as if we have 50 countries inside one country. So just be cognizant of that. And, it's 50 states, 4 major time zones. Uh, don't think you can have one
Yeah.
size fits all.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And Raj, I'll add to that because I think, one of the things and that we've seen, and this might sound uh um this might sound like a kind of a no-brainer, but this notion of fully committing. You have to fully commit to the US market, but that doesn't mean you're trying to commit to the entire whole 50 different states, 50 different mini countries within the US. And why I say that is because going halfway into the US market rarely works for brands. And this idea of committing to localized resources, committing to understanding, I'm going to say a statement that, and we hear it all the time, but like as a company coming from abroad, Americanizing your value proposition. I talked about the, Tesco, how they did not necessarily Americanize their value proposition and their positioning, but Americanizing that positioning in getting within that positioning is what's in it for me, the customer, not necessarily what's in it for or what it's about the tech and the specs of the things, because the American marketplace prefers confident, kind of outcome driven communications. What can it do for me? And under that banner of fully committing, also is we hit upon this. Test before you scale. Identify market segments that you want to go after, and we had talked about some regional differences from the Californias to New York to different regions within the U.S. But soft launch and test markets. Um, Helps you understand not
Mhm.
only how your product, your story, your brand story, your sales, but how everything kind of performs within that, even down to marketing channels. And I can't emphasize the importance of that because it won't be, to Roger's point, one size fits all. Um, but from your brand story and brand perspective, in the spirit of fully committing, have that story identified and kind of locked in, um, centered around customer need, customer outcome, customer benefit. Because, at the end of the day, that's what's going to drive the conversation. That's what's going to drive we call it eyebrow raise. When you get someone to raise their eyebrow and they're understanding your story and your value prop that resonates with them, um, that opens up doors. And that has opened up doors for sales to have the conversation they may need to have. That opens up doors for marketing that's engaging in the customers. So I just would say, as a close, just fully commit, but commit with smart application. And you can't commit to the entire nation,
Mhm.
but I think well prepared market entries stand on understanding the U.S. confident, fast-paced, kind of decision culture, but also understanding how, where, and when to apply that based on your customer base or how you've segmented it out, and just that idea of committing, but committing smart and not going in halfway, because halfway will just not to use the Tesco example, but that's kind of what happened to them is they decided to go halfway in and didn't have their brand story or their value proposition properly identified for the American market, and they left in 2013.
Amazing, amazing. Brian, Roger, thank you so much for all the different insights and nuances, and for going very deep on all of my questions. Is there something that you feel that we haven't touched upon?
You ask, is a local presence mandatory, or what are the main concerns of working with external partners? And you know, this is going to sound kind of like an MBA business side things, but like the US market across the board, and we had talked about how it's vast differences, but this idea of on time, on budget, and the agreed quality of level of the thing that's being sold is very, very key. And I know that's a
Mhm.
basic business principle because US companies are open for partnering with external vendors. They do it all the time. And I think we're a culture that values specialization and they also kind of outsourcing of non-core functions. I think one of the key here is just thinking
Mhm.
about and how you identify that local presence, because that builds credibility. And I don't think we touched upon that a little
Okay.
bit earlier when we're talking about working with partners from abroad or any concerns with external partners. or is a local presence mandatory? It's not necessarily mandatory, but that local presence builds credibility, and credibility opens up conversational doors.
Thank you for adding that. Rodger, do you think there's anything else that's you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would just say from my and within the context of working with you on this podcast is that the importance of having connectivity and partnership in our business with multiple agencies, that can really accelerate your learning and your on the ground experience. And it goes both ways. Understand the country and culture that is trying to come to the States and understand the country and understand America.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm super grateful for you joining the podcast, for you giving so much insight. And again, just adding context and going deep. That has been super, super helpful. And Rodger was just speaking about how important it is to choose multiple agencies, and work with them, because that will make your life easier, speed the process. I guess if there's one final thought, and then we can close this.
I've got nothing else to add. I think you gave a good summary, and this is a very in-depth exploration into an important topic for many, many clients.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rodger. Thank you, Bryan. I super appreciate your time and your insights.